The air is thick with the smell of sulfur and scorched earth. To the east, the sun is just beginning to crest the horizon, but its light is drowned out by a terrifying, unnatural glow. Behind him, a city, a civilization, is being erased from the map by a rain of fire. Lot stumbles, his lungs burning, his feet bruised by the jagged rocks of the mountain path. His daughters are sobbing, their hands gripping his robe so tightly, their knuckles are white. He wants to look back. He wants to scream. But the command of the angels rings in his ears like a hammer on an anvil. Escape for your life. Do not look back. In this moment, Lot is a man who has lost everything: his home, his wealth, his reputation, and, in a devastating instant, on the trail behind him, his wife. How did a man who started his journey walking alongside the friend of God end up cowering in a cave, watching his world turn to ash? To understand how Lot reached this terrifying mountain pass, we have to go back to the dust of Ur and the tents of Haran. Lot wasn't a nobody. He was the nephew of Abram, the man who would become Abraham. When the call of God came to Abram to leave everything behind, Lot was there. He wasn't just a tag-along. He was a partner in the pilgrimage. Lot grew up in the shadow of spiritual greatness. He watched Abram build altars. He heard the voice of the patriarch interceding with the Almighty. He saw the miraculous provision of God firsthand. But there was a subtle danger in Lot's position, one that many believers face today. Lot was following a man who followed God, but he hadn't quite learned how to follow God for himself. This is the first great lesson Lot's life offers us. It is a blessing to be mentored by godly authority, but spiritual hitchhiking has its limits. You cannot live off the borrowed faith of your leaders forever. Eventually, your own heart will be tested. As the years passed, God's blessing on Abram began to spill over onto Lot. Their flocks multiplied. Their tents stretched across the hillsides of Canaan. But with great blessing comes great responsibility, and often great friction. The land could not support both of them. The wells were crowded, the grazing land was sparse, and the herders began to clash. Arguments turned into shouting matches. Shouting matches threatened to turn into blood feuds. Lot found himself at a crossroads. He was under the authority and protection of Abram, the man who had been like a father to him. Yet the daily grind of rights and territory began to gall him. He felt he deserved his own space. This is where we see the biblical way out for those struggling with godly authority. Look at Abram's heart. He didn't pull rank. He didn't demand his way. He offered Lot a choice. But look at Lot's heart. He chose based on sight, not on spirit. Lot looked out over the Jordan Valley. It was lush. It was green. It looked like the Garden of Eden or the rich plains of Egypt. It was the best land by every worldly metric. So, Lot took it. He moved his tents toward Sodom, choosing the good life over the God life that stayed with Abram on the dusty, difficult hills. Lot didn't wake up one morning and decide to live in a den of iniquity. It was a slow, measured drift. First, he pitched his tent near Sodom. Then, he moved into Sodom. Eventually, we find him sitting in the gate of Sodom. In the ancient world, sitting in the gate meant you were a leader. You were part of the city council. Lot had become a success in the eyes of the world. He was a man of influence. But the cost was staggering. The Bible tells us in the New Testament that Lot was a righteous man who was vexed in his soul by the lawlessness he saw every day. Imagine the internal torture. He was a believer living in a culture that mocked everything he believed. He was a man of God trying to fit into a city of sin. But here is the danger of the compromised middle. Lot had enough of God to be miserable in the world, but too much of the world to be joyful in God. He thought he could influence the city, but the city was influencing his family. This is a warning for every believer today. You cannot tame a culture that God has marked for judgment. if you pitch your tent toward Sodom, eventually you will find yourself sitting in its gate, losing your voice and your power. But God is a God of mercy, and He gave Lot a grace-filled wake-up call. A coalition of kings swept through the valley, conquered Sodom, and took Lot and his family captive. Lot lost everything in a single afternoon. It was Abram, the man Lot had separated from, the authority he had walked away from, who came to the rescue. Abram didn't say, "I told you so." He armed his servants, chased down the invaders, and brought Lot back. This was Lot's chance. This was the moment to say, "Uncle, I was wrong. The green grass of the valley isn't worth the soul rot of the city. Let me come back to the altars." But Lot didn't. He went right back to Sodom. This teaches us something profound about the human heart. Sometimes we mistake God's deliverance for God's approval. We think because we survived the crisis, we don't need to change our direction. But the rescue was meant to be a U-turn, not a green light to keep going. The sun was setting on Sodom for the last time. Two strangers, angels in the guise of men, entered the city gate. Lot, perhaps remembering the hospitality of Abram's tent, insisted they stay with him. He knew the streets weren't safe. What followed was a night of absolute horror. The men of the city surrounded Lot's house, demanding the strangers be handed over for abuse. Lot's response shows how far his morality had been eroded by his surroundings. He offered his own daughters to the mob to protect his guests. Lot was trying to be righteous by protecting his guests, but he was doing it with the logic of Sodom. He was a man paralyzed by compromise. Even when the angels struck the mob with blindness and told Lot to get his family out because judgment was coming, Lot lingered. He hesitated. He went to his sons-in-law, and they laughed at him. To them, Lot had no spiritual authority because his life didn't match his message. This is the tragedy of the silent believer. When you finally speak up for God, the people you've tried so hard to impress will think you're joking. The morning light was breaking. The angels were urgent. "Hurry, take your wife and your 2 daughters." And still, Lot hesitated. The text contains one of the most beautiful and terrifying lines in Scripture. But he lingered. So the men seized him and his wife and his 2 daughters by the hand, the Lord being merciful to him. God literally had to drag Lot out of the fire. Lot didn't want the mountain. He wanted a small city nearby called Zoar. He was still bargaining with God. Even in the middle of a literal apocalypse, Lot was trying to maintain a little bit of his old life. And then, the fire fell. Behind him, his wife, whose heart was still tied to the closets, the social circles, and the comforts of Sodom, turned back. In that moment of rebellion, she became a pillar of salt, a monument to the danger of looking back at what God has told you to leave. The story of Lot ends in a dark cave. From a man who once had flocks and herds and tents, so great the land couldn't hold them, he is reduced to a man hiding in a hole in the ground, terrified of the world. The final chapters of his life are clouded by shame and the birth of nations, the Moabites and the Ammonites, who would become perpetual enemies of God's people. It is a somber, heavy ending to a life that began with so much promise. As we look at the life of Lot, we don't see a bad man. We see a righteous man who made small, disastrous choices. On authority, when you have a disagreement with a godly authority, like Lot did with Abram, the way out isn't to look for the greenest grass. It is to prioritize the presence of God over the prosperity of the world. Peace is not found in distance. It's found in alignment with God's will. On compromise, you cannot change Sodom by becoming a citizen of it. The only way to save a drowning world is to keep your feet on the rock. On grace. Lot's story is ultimately a story of God's relentless mercy. Even when we linger, even when we hesitate, God is the one who seizes us by the hand to pull us from the flame. Lot's life is a mirror. It asks us, where are your tents pitched today? Are you looking toward the hills where the altars are? Or are you looking toward the valley where the lights are? May we be a people who don't just follow the Abrams in our lives, but who develop a heart that beats for the Almighty, a heart that never has to be dragged toward safety,